In the world of Nova Thulium, amidst the tall cliffs and sweeping plains, beneath the shadow of its noble estates, a child named Tacitan was born into the service of House Calga. Life as a servant to the nobility was not one of glory or choice. It was a path walked in silence, with bowed heads and busy hands, where the weight of one's birth was a constant companion. Even as a young boy, Tacitan would gaze towards the distant stars, his heart stirring with a longing he could not name. The fields and countryside of Nova Thulium appeared so small to him then, though they stretched on endlessly, their boundaries pressed in by the high stone walls of the estate. He would wonder in those quiet moments if he was destined for something beyond this place. But Tacitan was not alone in his dreams. With him always at his side was Primaris Calga, heir to the very house that Tacitan served. The two boys, though divided by class and station, had formed a bond in their early years. A bond that seemed to blur the lines of social status and financial wealth. Regardless of all the titles that would one day be his, he cared little for the rules of the world he was born into. He would share his meals with Tacitus, climb the same trees, and speak openly of the ambitions they held in their hearts. Tacitan often thought about that, in the quiet house after they played, when the rest of the household had retired and only the soft winds of the evening stirred outside his small window. What a strange thing it was, he thought, to be born a servant, but to feel no different from the one whom you served. If not for the name he bore, he could have been Primaris, and if not for his lineage, Primaris could have been him. We are alike, Primaris would often say, lying on the grassy hills that overlooked the sprawling estate, more alike than any would guess. And Tacitan believed it. He believed that together they could rise above the titles and roles that bound them. Both boys shared the same dream, though for Tacitan it had become something more than a dream. It had become a need to become a space marine. Munius would say, eyes bright with hope, is to leave this world behind, to fight for the Empire, to protect the Imperium. There's nothing noble. In those moments, Tacitan would find his thoughts drifting away from Nova Thulium, away from the fields, the walls, and the expectations that seemed to tighten around him like a net. He could feel, as if in his bones, that there was a place for him in the stars, a place where he could be more than what he was born to be. But such thoughts often brought doubt. What if he was wrong? What if no matter how fiercely he believed, the blood in his veins would always bind him to the soil? In the moments of solitude, when the estate was still, Tacitan would wonder at his own ambitions. What right did a soul have to each of such things? Every morning, as the dawn light broke across the horizon, and Manny had spoken of the future, Titan would feel the flame of hope rekindled. In time, that hope became action. As they grew, both Tacitan and Manius were selected to train as aspirants, to walk the treacherous path towards becoming Space Marines. It was a path fraught with danger, and one that few survived, but they went together, their steps unwavering, as they boarded the transport that would take them to Thulium, where their training would begin. The training was harsh, as they knew it would be. Their mentor, a grizzled and battle-scarred astronaut by the name of Kaisus, wasted no time in testing their endurance, their strength, and their willpower. The days stretched long, filled with grueling exercises that left their muscles aching and their spirits frayed, but it was the nights that weighed heaviest on Taciturn. In those moments, when the camp had settled into an uneasy silence, his mind would wander back to Nova Thulium, to the simplicity of those days, when dreams were all that mattered. He would glance at Manius, who lay beside him in their shaded backs, and wonder if his friend ever doubted as well. For Manius, it seemed, had always carried a certainty that Tacitan had struggled to grasp. Yet Tacitan's resolve never faltered, not truly, for even in his quiet doubts, he knew there was no turning back, to return to the life of a sufferer now, after tasting even a glimpse of what could be, would be a fate worse than death. But as the weeks turned into months, Tacitus began to notice a shift. It was subtle at first, an odd glance from Sixus, a strange stillness among the other aspirants, late in the evenings. At first, he brushed it aside, telling himself that it was merely his own anxiety, the pressures of his harsh training weighing on his mind. But soon the feeling grew too strong to ignore. There was a heaviness in the air that followed them through the training halls, something taciturn that could be sensed but could not yet be named. One night, as the moon hung low over the terrain, Titan awoke to a cold sweat. He rose quietly from his bunk and made his way through the darkened camp, driven by a sense that something was terribly wrong. In the distance, the faint flicker of firelight caught his eye. It danced along the stone walls of the training hall, where he had seen nothing but shadows before. His heart began to pound and his steps quickened. When he reached the hall, the sight before him made his blood run cold. Kixus stood before a dark altar, his hands slick with the crimson of fresh blood. Surrounding him were several of the other aspirants, their faces twisted into unnatural grins, their eyes filled with a madness that Titan had never seen before. At first, he could not comprehend what he was witnessing. But then his gaze fell upon the altar itself, and there, etched into the stone, was the unmistakable symbol of the deity associated with blood. Tacitus's breath caught in his throat. His mentor, the man who had been shaping him, guiding him, was no loyal servant of the Empire. He had fallen to chaos, and in his fall he had taken the other aspirants with him. Taciturne's mind reeled, the weight of the discovery crashing down upon him. But there was no time for shock, no time for fear. His only thought was to escape, to warn Meneos, to warn the Ultramarines of what had happened here. But as he turned to flee, a cold hand gripped his shoulder, and Tacitus found himself staring into the pale face of his foe Meneos, who had followed him into the hall. Manis, too, had seen the situation that unfolded before them, and his expression was one of disbelief, of silent shock. "We must leave," Taciturn whispered, though the words felt hollow in the face of what they had just learned. Before they could move, the voice of Kixus rang out through the hall, deep and menacing. "You cannot leave," the corrupted mentor growled. "You belong to the blood god now, as we all do." The air grew thick with the scent of ion and incense, and as the cultists advanced upon them, Taciturn knew that their lives would never be the same. The world they had known, the dreams they had shared, were gone, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of betrayal. Taciturn could feel his heart aching in his chest, every beat pounding in his ears, as he and Mamaea stood frozen in the doorway, watching the ritual unfold. It was as if time had stopped, trapping them in this terrible moment. The air was thick with the sickeningly sweet stench of ion and incense, and the mad eyes of Sixus gleamed in the firelight as he raised his hands over the altar, his voice low and guttural, rumbling through the hall like distant thunder. "You were never meant to see this," Kixus growled, turning his gaze toward the two boys. The flickering flames cast strange shadows across his face, giving him the appearance of some ancient, malevolent spectre. But no matter, concern comes not from whence the blood flows, only that it does. Taciturne's breath caught in his throat, his body tensing as he realized the full gravity of the situation. They had uncovered a secret that could never be allowed to leave this hall. The other aspirants, those they had trained alongside, laughed with, shared meals with, were not friends, they were cultists, followers of a twisted ideology, their minds warped by the promises of power and influence. Then, Tacitus whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. His hand gripped Mammius's arm, pulling him toward the exit. But before they could take even a single step, the door slammed shut with a heavy final sound, sealing them in with their enemies. The followers of Kixus moved quickly, surrounding them, weapons in hand. The air was thick with tension, each breath drawn painfully, as if the very atmosphere sought to suffocate their hope. Taciturne's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. They were trapped, and the cultists were closing in. Then, with a sudden cry, Mammius drew his blade, his voice filled with the same fiery determination that had always marked him as a leader, even in their youth. "We will not die here," he shouted, his sword flashing in the dim light, for the Empire. The first cultist lunged at Manes, but he was ready. With a swift strike he felled the man, blood spilling across the stone floor in thick, dark rivulets. For a moment, there was hope, a fleeting, fragile thing that flickered in Titan's chest, like the flame of a candle in the wind. But Kixus was no ordinary foe. With a roar, he surged forward, axe raised high above his head, his eyes wild with the madness of one who had given himself fully to chaos. His strike came faster than Tacitan could have imagined, a blur of motion that left him gasping in fear. Menneus tuned to meet the blow, but he was a boy, still learning the ways of war. His courage was boundless, but his body was not yet tempered by the battlefields that awaited him. Sixus's axe descended with brutal force, the sound of it cutting through the air like a thunderclap. Menneus raised his blade to block the strike, but the weight of the blow was too much. His sword shattered in his hands, and the force of the impact sent him crashing to the ground. No. Tacitan's scream tore from his throat, but it was too late. The cultists swarmed over Menneus, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. He fought as fiercely as any Space Marine would have, but there were too many. In the blink of an eye, he was overwhelmed, his young body broken beneath the onslaught. Time seemed to stretch out, each heartbeat dragging on like an eternity. Tacitun's world narrowed to the sight of his friend, his brother in all but blood, lying motionless on the cold stone floor. The noise of the hall faded, the chants of the cultists, the cackling of the flames, all of it reduced to a distant hum. All that remained was the stillness of that terrible moment, and the hollow ache that filled Tastian's chest. But then something else stirred within him. Grief, yes, but also anger, an emotion so deep, so consuming, that it threatened to swallow him whole. His vision blurred, the edges of his mind darkening, as the fire of vengeance ignited within him. He could not let this end here. He would not let Mani's name be forgotten. Tacitan rose to his feet, his fists clenched tightly around the hilt of his sword. The cultists barely noticed him. So focused were they on their gruesome task. But that would be their undoing. For in that moment, Tacitan was no longer just a boy, no longer just a sufferer, dreaming of escape. He was a warrior, forged in the crucible of loss and pain, and there was no mercy left in his heart. With a cry of fury, he launched himself at the nearest cultist, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. The man fell, his blood splattering the floor in thick, dark pools. One by one, Tacitus struck down the followers of Con, his movements fueled by a single, unwavering thought. Maius would not be forgotten. His name would live on, even if Tacitus had to carve it into the very stars themselves. The cultists fell one after another, until only Sixus remained. The figure stood tall, his blood-stained axe held loosely in his hands, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You think you can kill me, boy?" Sixus sneered, his voice dipping with disdain. "You think the blood god cares for your pitiful revenge?" Tacitan said nothing. He did not need to. His silence was answer enough. The two clashed, their blades ringing out in the stillness of the hall. Sixus was strong, far stronger than any mortal man had a right to be. But Tacitan fought with a determination that surpassed mere strength. His strikes were swift, precise, each one carrying the weight of his vow, his promise to keep Menneus's name alive. The battle raged on, each strike pushing Tacitan to the limits of his endurance. His muscles ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he would not stop. He could not stop, not until Sixus lay dead at his feet. Just as his strength began to falter, when it seemed that the Tyto would finally overwhelm him, the doors of the hall burst open with a deafening crash. Ultramarines, clad in their shining cerulean armor, stormed into the room, their weapons raised high. They moved with precision and power, cutting down the remaining cultists in a blur of bolt fire and chainswords. Tacitan fell to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion, as the Ultramarines swept through the hall. He watched, his vision blurring, as they took control, their presence a reminder of the Emperor's light, even in the darkest of places. Kixus, seeing his defeat, made one final, desperate attempt to flee, but the Ultramarines were swift. With a single devastating blow, they ended his life, his body falling to the floor with a heavy thud. It was over. Tacitan's heart ached, not with relief, but with the hollow pain of loss. Menneus was gone, but his name would not be. Rising to his feet, Tacitan looked upon the fallen body of his foe and made a vow that would carry him through the trials to come. Manius Calga's name would not die here. The fires of battle still smoldered in Tacitan's heat, as he stood before the towering gates of the fortress monastery on Macragge. It had been some time since the blood-soaked night on Thulium, but the memory of that place clung to him, heavy as a cloak in winter. The taste of grief had not yet left his mouth, nor had the weight of his promise lightened. His old life, and even his old name, seemed distant now, like a dream, half forgotten in the cold light of morning. He was no longer Taciturn, the boy born into service. He was Mains Calga, and the name rested upon him with all the gravity of an oath sworn before the Emperor himself. Before him stood the walls of Ultramar, the gleaming celestial armor catching the morning light. The Ultramarines had come for him that night, just as the last of his strength had slipped away, and in their arms he had found the very salvation he and Mains had long dreamed of. Yet as they led him away from the wreckage of Thulium mine, his mind had not been on the glory of battle, nor the towering figures of the Space Marines who towered above him. It had been on the lifeless form of his friend, and the vow that had bound him to this new name, this new path. Now he stood upon the threshold of the Ultramarines chapter, ready to begin the journey that would carry him toward the destiny he had claimed. His hand tightened around the haft of his blade, the weight of it a comfort in this moment of uncertainty. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with anticipation. For all the pain and loss that had made his path, this was what he had sought. This was what he had dreamed of. At his side stood Captain Keto Sikias, a towering figure whose very presence seemed to hum with authority. Clad in the ornate armor of a first company, Captain Sikias was a warrior of renown, his deeds spoken of in reverent tones across the many worlds of Ultima. His stern gaze fell upon Mamaeus, measuring, weighing, in that gaze. Mamaeus felt the full burden of his new name. This was no place for boys of dreams. This was a place of warriors, forged in the Emperor's light and tempered by the fires of war. Your journey begins here, applicant, Sikias said, his voice as cold and unyielding as the stone beneath their feet. You will be tested, as all who come to us are. Your past means nothing. Your bloodline means nothing. Only your strength and your will to serve the Empire will carry you forward. Maius nodded, the words settling into his heart like stones dropped into a deep well. His past meant nothing. That was a comfort in its way. He had no desire to carry the weight of who he had been. The name of Tacitan was buried with the boy who had once been his friend. Only Manius Calga remained, and it was under that name that he would carve his future. The gates of the fortress monastery creaked open, revealing the vast training grounds beyond. As Manea stepped through, his senses were assaulted by the sights and sounds of the chapter's daily life. Space Marines moved in ordered lines across the parade grounds, their armor gleaming in the sun. In the distance he could hear the rhythmic clash of weapons, the unmistakable sound of warriors honing their skills in the art of battle. Here was no rest, no respite, each man strained as though the fate of the Empire itself rested upon his shoulders. And in many ways it did. Manius's steps faltered for just a moment, as the enormity of it all threatened to overwhelm him. But then Sikias's voice cut through the noise, sharp as a blade. "Look well, Calga," the captain said, his tone as hard as iron. "This is what it means to serve. From this day forth, you are no longer a boy. You are an aspirant of the Ultramarines, and you will be judged not by your words, but by your actions. Each of these warriors has earned his place here, and if you wish to stand among them, you will do the same." Maius squared his shoulders, the weight of his new identity settling more firmly upon him. There was no room for doubt now. He had taken on the name of Maius Calga, and with it came the weight of expectation, both from those who now surrounded him and from the memory of the boy who had fallen. Under the mentorship of Cato Sikias, Mamius began the arduous process of becoming a full-fledged astute. The training was relentless, designed to push even the strongest aspirants to their very limits. Days bled into nights, as they were tested physically, mentally, and spiritually. Maius was no stranger to hardship. The memories of his escape from the blood-soaked holes of Thulium had hardened him in ways few could understand. But here, in the shadow of Macragge's mountains, he learned what it truly meant to be an ultimate individual. Zacchaeus was not a man given to kindness or praise. His lessons were harsh, his expectations even harsher. Yet beneath the cold, unyielding exterior, there was wisdom. Wisdom born of centuries spent in the Emperor's service. Wisdom that Manea soaked in with the hunger of one who knew his very soul was being shaped by each passing day. "Discipline is your shield," Zacchaeus would say, his voice ringing out across the training grounds, as Maius and the other aspirants went through their drills. "Without it, even the greatest strength will falter. You are not just a warrior, Cougar. You are a servant of the Empire. Your life is no longer your own." It was in these lessons that Munoz truly began to understand the depth of the vow he had taken. The name he bore was no longer just a mantle of honor. It was a binding oath, one that would define his every action. The path ahead was clear, but it was one that would demand everything of him, and still the weight of it felt lighter than the grief he had carried. To serve the Empire was to find purpose in the chaos, to find light in the endless dark. The other aspirants regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect. His skills in combat were undeniable, honed by the terrible night on Thulium and sharpened by his time under Zacchaeus' tutelage, but it was his will, his unwavering determination, that set him apart. He was a man who had lost everything, yet had found in that loss a strength that few could match. As the years passed, Munoz began to rise through the ranks of the chapter. His skills were tested in battle, first in minor skirmishes on the fringes of Ultramar's borders, and then in large campaigns that saw him pitted against the hordes of the galaxy, the forces of chaos, the relentless orcs, and the Xenos that sought to tear the Imperium apart. Throughout it all, Zacchaeus remained a constant presence, guiding Munoz with the same firm hand that had shaped him in those early days. Their relationship, once defined by the strict hierarchy of master and apprentice, had grown into something more, something akin to respect. For Zacchaeus had seen in Munoz the potential for greatness, and Munoz, in turn, had proven himself time and again. Yet, for all the battles won, for all the victories earned, Munoz never forgot the name he bore. Every sword stroke, every decision made in the heat of battle, was a tribute to the boy who had fallen. The boy who had dreamed of becoming a space marine, and who now lived on in Munoz's every breath. As the days of his training drew to a close, and the time came for Maines to fully claim his place among the Ultramarines, he stood once more at the gates of the fortress monastery. But this time, he stood not as an aspirant, but as a warrior, a man forged in the fires of loss and rebirth. He had become more than taciturn, more than a servant of House Calga. He had become Manius Calga, and his name would live on, not just in memory, but in the deeds he would carve into the very stars. For he had taken an oath, and that oath would shape the rest of his life. The skies over Shaudon burned a deep, angry red, streaked with the smoke of battle and the fire of 1,000 warships. For from orbit, the world looked like a festering wound, its surface scarred by the relentless conflict between the forces of the Imperium and the orcs that had infested the system. The air, thick with the acid scent of war, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of destruction. For weeks, the Ultramarines, under the command of Chapter Master Pytho, had fought to turn the tide in this unforgiving campaign. And though they had seen victories, the price paid in blood had been steep. Maius Calga, now a veteran warrior of the Ultramarines, stood at the command deck of the battle barge, Valin's shield, his face set in a grim expression as he surveyed the scene below. He had fought on many worlds. Since his induction into the chapter, he had led men to victory, tasted the bitter sting of defeat, and carved his name into the annals of history. But he, on Shaudon, something felt different. There was an unease that hung in the air, not just from the aura of battle, but from something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He could feel it, in the way the other officers spoke in hushed tones, the way their eyes flickered nervously whenever the Vox communications fell silent. It was not just the outsiders' savagery, as they were, that weighed on their hearts. There was something else. a shadow creeping ever close, and Mameus, though still young in the eyes of his chapter, had learned to trust his instincts. Besides him stood Chapter Master Piel, a towering figure who had led the Ultramarines through countless wars. His armor, battered and scarred from over 100 battles, gleamed in the dim light of the bridge. Pythol had been a steady hand throughout the campaign, his leadership unwavering, even as the obstacles grew more relentless. Yet now, as they approached what should have been the final push to victory, there was a heaviness in his gaze, a weariness that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. Python's voice, deep and commanding, cut through the silence. He said, without turning his head, "What do you see down there?" Mameus shifted his gaze from the burning planet to the tactical hololith before them, where the enemy positions were displayed in stark relief. The Ox were massing for another assault, their crude machines already lumbering towards the Imperial lines. It was a familiar sight, one they had seen many times before, yet something about it felt wrong. The scope of all their brutality, we were not typically this organized. Their attacks were usually chaotic, uncoordinated. But here on Shaodon, they moved with a purpose that was unsettling. "There's something dividing them," Manea said, his voice steady. "They are not acting like original characters." Pythol nodded slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, as though drawing strength from the weapon at his side. "You're right," he murmured. "Something is driving them, but whatever it is, we don't have the luxury of waiting to find out. We push forward, and we conclude this." Mameus nodded in agreement, though his heart was heavy with doubt. Victory heaved, and now seemed so close, yet he could not shake the feeling that it was a fragile thing, a flame flickering in the wind, ready to be snuffed out at any moment. The plan was set. The Ultramarines would lead the final assault against the OK stronghold, on the surface a fortress of steel and stone that dominated the landscape. Python himself would lead the charge. As was his way, he had always believed in leading from the front. His presence, a rallying point for the warriors who fought under him. It was a strategy that had earned him both admiration and success, but it had never failed him until today. The battle on the surface was as brutal as any they had fought. The oscillations came in waves, their guttural oscillations filling the air. As they hurled themselves at the ultimate lines, Mameus fought alongside his brothers, his bolt blazing as he cut down the enemy in droves. But even as he fought, he could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The enemy was unrelenting, their numbers seemingly endless, and for every step the Ultramarines took towards the fortress, they were pushed back too. At the height of the battle, Pythos fought with the strength and ferocity of a warrior, born of war. His sword cleaved through the chaos after chaos, his movements precise and deadly. But even as he fought, he could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The Oxen were unrelenting, their numbers seemingly endless, and for every step the Ultramarines took towards the fortress, they were pushed back too. At the heat of the battle, Pythos fought with the strength and ferocity of a warrior, born for war. His sword cleaved through all after all, his movements precise and deadly. Yet for all his power, even a chapter master is not invincible. The moment came suddenly without warning. One moment Pytho was at the forefront of the assault, cutting down the enemies before him. The next, an explosion tore through the battlefield, a massive war machine unleashing its fury upon the ultimate lines. Manea saw it happen as if in slow motion, the flames, the smoke, the bodies of his brothers thrown through the air like rag dolls. And then in the midst of the chaos, he saw Pythol fall. The sight struck Maneus like a blow to the chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. For a moment, the battle around him faded, the sounds of gunfire and screaming lost in the sudden, deafening silence that filled his mind. Python, the man, who had led the Ultramarines through so many wars, lay motionless on the ground, his once gleaming armor now blackened and broken. Time seemed to bend and warp in that moment, stretching out impossibly long. Munoz could not move, could not think. All he could do was stare at the fallen form of his chapter master. The weight of the loss was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. The battle raged on around him, but it seemed distant now, like something happening in another world. Then slowly reality began to seep back in. The battle was not over, the Oaks were still coming, and the Ultramarines needed a leader. Manny's heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline flowing through his veins. As his mind struggled to catch up with the gravity of what had just occurred, Python was dead, and now the weight of command, the burden of leadership, fell upon his shoulders. He had known Pythos for years, respected him, followed him into battle, learned from him, and now, in the span of a single heartbeat, the future of the Ultramarines lay in his hands. The weight of it was overwhelming, crushing, but there was no time for doubt, no time for hesitation. The enemy would not wait for him to mourn. With a deep breath, Manius stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Both of these are to me," he shouted, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. The utmost resilience, their resolve momentarily shattered by the explosion, remained steadfast in response to his call, their discipline unshakable, even in the face of such a profound loss. "We fight on," Mamaeus continued, his voice steady, though his heart still ached with the loss of Pythol, for the empire of Pythol, and they fought on. The battle raging for hours, the Oaks pushing the Ultramarines to the very brink, but Munius led them, with a resolve that even he had not known he possessed. His every move was calculated, his every ode precise. Where the occasion presented itself, he was the bolt in hand, cutting down the enemy with a ferocity that inspired those around him. In the face of overwhelming odds, Mania stood tall, the weight of leadership settling on him like a mantle. When at last, the final enemy fell and the battlefield fell silent, save for the cackling of flames and the distant rumble of eating war machines, Mania stood alone atop the ruins of the enemy stronghold. Around him, the bodies of his brothers and his enemies alike lay strewn across the battlefield, a grim testament to the cost of victory. But victory was not as the smoke cleared, and the surviving Ultramarines gathered around him. Munios looked to the sky, his thoughts heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost. Chapter Master, Python had given his life for this victory, and now the mantle of leadership, the mantle of Chapter Master, had passed to Manius. It was not a title he had sought, no one he had expected to be so soon, but as he looked into the eyes of his brothers, who now looked to him for guidance, for strength, he knew that this was the path that fate had laid before him. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of the name he had taken, Manius Calga, Chapter Master of the Ultramarines, and with that weight came the knowledge that the future of his chapter, and perhaps the future of the Imperium itself, now rested in his hands. The seas of Thalassa churned like a great beast, stirred from its slumber, waves crashing against the shores, in a violent symphony of nature's fury. Above the skies were dark, heavy with storm clouds that seemed to mirror the turmoil below. But it was not the tempest that filled the hearts of the warriors standing upon the cliffs with death. It was the threat that lay beyond the storm, the threat that had come from the stars, to lay waste to their world. The Ox had descended upon Thalassa like a plague, their crude ships tearing through the planet's defenses with brutal efficiency. The cities, once proud bastions of ultimate ode, had been ravaged, their streets choked with smoke and the dead. What had begun as a simple aid had turned into a full-scale invasion, and the defenders of Thalassa found themselves outnumbered, their forces stretched thin against the relentless tide of green-skinned savagery. But when others saw only despair, Mamaeus Calga saw opportunity. The weight of the chapter rested heavily on his shoulders now. Since the death of Chapter Master Pythol on Chadon, Calga had borne the burden of leadership, though the formal title had not yet been bestowed upon him. He had led the Ultramarines through battles and skirmishes, each one testing his resolve, but none had proven decisive, at least not yet. The eyes of his brothers were upon him, watching, waiting for the moment when he would prove himself worthy of the title that Pythol had left behind. Now, on the windswept shoes of Thalassa, that moment had come. The Ultramarines stood in formation, their armor gleaming in the dim light of the storm. Behind them, the ocean sprawled, its fury a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Before them, the Ox massed in the distance, their crude machines belching smoke and fire into the sky. As they prepared for the final push, Calga stood at the font, his eyes scanning the horizon, his mind already calculating the odds. He had spent hours poring over battle reports, mapping the terrain, considering every possible strategy. He Codex Astartes, the sacred tome written by Rabuti Guilliman himself, was clear in its teachings that order and discipline would be their greatest weapons against the orcs' chaotic onslaught. But Calgod knew that the Codex was not just a rulebook. It was a living guide meant to be interpreted and adapted. Guilliman had designed it to be flexible, to suit the needs of the battle at hand. And this battle, Colgan knew, would require more than rigid adherence to tradition. A lesser commander might have held the line, digging in to weather the expected assault, but Calga understood the enemy better than that. The forces thrived on brute force, overwhelming their foes with sheer numbers. To meet them head-on would be folly. What was needed here was precision strategy, something that the opposition could not hope to match. He turned to his captains, men who had fought alongside him through countless battles, their trust in him unshakable. Captain Zacchaeus stood closest, his eyes bright with anticipation, eager for the fight. But even he, with all his bravado, understood the seriousness of the task before them. "We will not wait for them to come to us," Cougar said, his voice steady, though the weight of command pressed down on him. "We take the fight to them." There was no question, no hesitation in his tone. The captains nodded, their confidence in their commander absolute. They had seen Kaiga lead before. They had witnessed his tactical brilliance, his ability to think several steps ahead of the enemy, and though this would be the greatest test of his command, thus far none doubted that he would see them through. The Thunderhawks' leader, Galga, observed, his mind already moving through the battle in his mind. Step by step they would strike at their heart, break their line, and their hold would collapse. The plan was simple, as all great strategies were. The Ox had amassed their forces in preparation for a final assault on the Ultramarines' position, confident in their overwhelming numbers. However, their command structure, such as it was concentrated in a single location. The OK Warboss's camp, nestled in the shadow of a great mountain ridge to the east. It was there that the leadership of the house had gathered, and it was there that the Ultramarines would strike. The Thunderhawks soared through the storm-tossed skies, their engines cutting through the howling winds, as they made their way toward the enemy's lair. Inside, Calga stood among his ways, his presence a steadying force. The weight of the chapter's future hung heavy upon him, but he bore it as he had borne all burdens with silent resolve. As they neared the enemy encampment, the Thunderhawks descended, their guns blazing, as they strafed the key positions below. The Ox were caught off guard by the sudden assault, scrambled to mount a defense, but it was too late. Calga and his strike force had already landed, their boots thudding into the mud as they charged forward into the fray. The battle was swift and brutal. The Ox, though fierce, were no match for the precision and discipline of the Ultramarines. Calga moved through the chaos like a stone incarnate, his powerful fist smashing through oak and bone with devastating force. He fought not just with the strength of his body, but with the strength of his mind. His every move calculated, his every strike purposeful. And at the heart of it all, there was Calga, his presence a beacon of hope for his brothers, a symbol of order amidst the chaos. The huge boss, nearly twice the size of an ordinary boss, charged at him with a bellowing roar, its crude axe raised high. But Calga met the beast head-on, his powerful fist crashing into the boss's chest with a force that shattered its ribcage and sent it tumbling to the ground in a heap of blood and broken steel. With the Wayboss dead, the OK's coordination faltered. Their hold, once an unstoppable tide, crumbled as their leaders fell, one by one, to the blades of the Ultramarines. It was over in minutes. The locals broke and fled in all directions. They were unable to fight, shattered by the precision and ferocity of the ultimate assault. When the smoke cleared, Kaulga stood amidst the wreckage, his arms slick with the blood of the enemy, his chest rising and falling with the exertion of battle. Around him, the bodies of the orcs lay strewn across the ground, their crude weapons and armor no match for the might of the estates. The victory was total. Late as the survivors of Thalassa emerged from their hiding places to survey the battlefield, the name of Manlius Calga was spoken with reverence. His decisive leadership had not only saved the planet, but had proven to all who witnessed it that he was worthy of the title that now awaited him. Back on Macragge, the formal ceremony took place in the grand halls of the fortress monastery, Calga. Knelt before the assembled officers of the chapter, his head bowed as the banners of the Ultramarines hung proudly from the walls. The honor guard stood in the ceremonial arena, stood in solemn witness, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight. At the center of the hall stood the relics of Gilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, his legacy etched into every corner of the room. And there, before the eyes of his brothers, Manius Calgar was formally named Chapter Master of the Ultramarines, the mantle of leadership passing to him in full. As he rose to his feet, the weight of the moment settled upon him like a cloak. He was no longer just a warrior, no longer just a leader on the battlefield. He was the master of the chapter, the guardian of Gilman's legacy, the protector of Ultramar itself. And with that title came the greatest responsibility of all, to uphold the teachings of the Codex Estates. The Codex, written by Gilliman himself, was the guiding light of the Ultramarines, a doctrine of old discipline and tactical genius. To Calgar, it was more than a book of rules. It was a living testament to the Primarch's vision for the Empire. Under his leadership, the Ultramarines would not just follow the Codex, they would embody it. Yet Calgar understood that the Codex was not infallible. Gilliman had written it to guide, not to shackle. To be a true leader, one had to know when to follow the letter of the Codex and when to adapt, when to forge new paths in the heat of battle. This was the lesson Calgar had learned at Thalassa, and it would guide him in the years to come. Under his command, the Ultramarines would remain the shining example of what it meant to be a Space Marine, the standard by which all other chapters measured themselves. And Manius Calgar, now fully a chapter master, would ensure that the legacy of Gilliman endured for generations to come. The skies above Macragge had always been a sight of wonder. To those who called the world home, clear, deep blue, stretching on for miles over the marble cities and towering citadels that were the pride of Ultramar. But now, those same skies seemed to darken, with each passing day, and the once peaceful air buzzed with the hum of preparation. For the first time in its long history, the jewel of Ultramar faced a threat that no one, not even the mightiest among them, could have foreseen. The Tyranids had come. It began as a rumor whispered among the stars, by scattered outposts and trading fleets, stories of entire systems devoured by a terrible force, of planets stripped bare in mere days, their inhabitants consumed by an alien hunger so vast, so incomprehensible that it defied all reason. At first, it seemed too horrific to be real, a phantom conjured by minds long lost to the depths of the galaxy. But as more and more reports filtered in, each one more dire than the last, the grim reality set in. Something monstrous was sweeping across the void, and its tendrils were reaching toward Ultramar. By the time the full scale of the threat became clear, it was already too late to halt its advance. The Hive Fleet, as it was called, moved with the speed of a storm, a swelling mass of bioships that blotted out the stars as it descended upon the worlds of the Imperium. The Tyranids were unlike anything the Imperium had ever faced, an insatiable swarm that knew no fear, no mercy, and no end. The purpose was simple: to consume all life, leaving nothing but barren, lifeless worlds in their wake. As the epochs came in, from the distant planets of Ultramar, it fell to Manius Calgar to ready the defense. He had faced many foes in his time as chapter master, including orcs, Titos, and Xenos of all kinds, but this was different. There was no negotiation with the Tyranids, no reasoning with them. They were a living nightmare, a tide of flesh and bone that swept over entire worlds and left nothing behind. It was a force of nature, and for the first time in his long years of service, Calgar found himself wondering whether the Ultramarines would survive. Yet, he had no time for doubt. His first duty was to the people of Ultramar, and he would see them protected no matter the cost. Immediately, he summoned the full might of the Ultramarines, calling forth every company, every veteran, and every resource at their disposal. The worlds of Ultramar. From the angry worlds to the fortress planets, We are fortified in preparation for the coming storm. The defenses, strengthened by the best strategists and engineers. The chapter had to offer the message that was clear: no world would fall without a fight. But even as the preparations were made, the true scope of the threat remained uncertain. How could one defend against an enemy that devoured everything in its path? How could the Ultramarines, for all their strength, hope to stand against such a relentless foe? Calga's mind tuned to Macragge, the heat of Ultramar, and it was there that he focused his efforts. If the Tyranids were to reach each Macragge, they would find it a fortress unassailable and defiant, its walls manned by the finest warriors the Imperium had to offer. When the Hive Fleet behemoth finally arrived, it was as though the void itself had opened and poured forth its most terrible creatures. The skies above Macragge darkened with the silhouette of alien ships, great biomonstrosities that pulsed with life as they descended upon the planet. The air was thick with the sound of alarms, and the ground shook with the thunder of artillery, as the first waves of the Tyranid swarm crashed against the defenses of Ultimar's capital. Calga stood at the heart of the command center, his presence a pillar of calm amidst the chaos. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and the cries of the wounded, but Calga's focus never wavered. He had prepared for this moment, had anticipated every possible move the tyrants might make. Now it was time to see if his strategy would hold. The Battle of Macragge was unlike any other. The Tyranids came in endless waves, their creatures swarming across the battlefield in a frenzy of teeth and claws. For every Xeno slain, a dozen more took its place, their numbers seemingly infinite, and yet the Ultramarines held firm. Kuga had positioned his forces with precision, deploying heavy weaponry and fortified lines that turned the battlefield into a deadly gauntlet for the Tyranids. Each step the swarm took was met with a storm of bolts, of fierce lascannons and flame. At the polar fortresses, where the cold winds howled across the barren ice fields, the first company, the most elite of the Ultramarines, held the line. These veterans, clad in their sacred Terminator armor, were a wall of celestial steel, their thunderous footsteps shaking the ground as they moved to intercept the Tyranid advance. The old place was crucial, for it was here, in these isolated fortresses, that the most vital command and control centers of Macca's defense were housed. Calga knew that the Tyranids would target these fortresses. The hive mind that guided the swarm was as relentless as it was cunning, always seeking to cut off the head of the snake. And so, he had ordered the first company to hold at all costs, to buy time for the defenses elsewhere on the planet to regroup and counterattack. It was a decision born of necessity, but also of bitter understanding. The men of the first company were the best the chapter had to offer, and it was here on the frozen fields of Macragge that they would make their stand. For 4 days the battle raged. The Tyranids threw themselves at the fortress, in a relentless assault, their bodies piling high against the walls, as the Ultramarines fought with every ounce of strength they possessed. The first company fought like heroes of old, their bolters blazing, and their powerful fists smashing through the alien tide. But the enemy was without number, and the cost was high. Even as Calga directed the defense from the capital, he received word that the situation at the polar fortresses was growing desperate. The Tyranids had breached the outer defenses, and the first company, though holding, was slowly being overwhelmed. Calga's heat weighed heavy with the knowledge that he had asked his finest warriors to make the ultimate sacrifice. But there was no other choice. If Macragge was to be saved, they had to hold. In the end, it was not the guns of the Ultramarines that won the day, but the strategic brilliance of Marnius Calga. Recognizing that the ground battle was merely a distraction, Calga ordered a daring counterattack in space, where the true threat of the Hive Fleet could be challenged in a bold maneuver. The Ultramarines' fleet, reinforced by elements of the Imperial Navy, launched a strike against the Hive ships themselves. The space battle was fierce, with the bioships of the Tyranids spewing forth more of their monstrous brood, even as the Imperial forces closed in. Calga, the tactician, coordinated the attack with precision, targeting the large ships that acted as synaptic nodes for the swarm. Without these guiding forces, the Tyranids on the ground would be thrown into disarray, and the Ultramarines could finally seize the advantage. And so it was with the destruction of the hive ships. The ground forces of the Tyranids faltered, the endless coordination that had driven their assault vanished, and the Ultramarines, seizing the moment, launched a counter-offensive that broke the back of the swarm. Victory was within their grasp, but it had come at a terrible cost. When the smoke cleared and the last of the Tyranid creatures lay dead on the icy fields of Macragge, the toll became clear. The First Company, those noble warriors who had fought so bravely in the polar fortresses, had been annihilated. The fortresses themselves lay in ruins, and the bodies of the Ultramarines were scattered across the battlefield like fallen giants. For all the brilliance of Calga's leadership, for all the strength and courage of the Ultramarines, the loss of the First Company was a wound that cut deep into the heart of the chapter. The reconstruction of the chapter would take years, and the memory of those lost would weigh heavily on Mainy's Calga for the rest of his days. But Ultramar had been saved, Macragge still stood, and the Tyranid threat, at least for now, had been defeated. As Calga looked out over the battlefield, his heart heavy with both victory and sorrow, he knew that this was only the beginning. The Tyranids would return, and the Imperium would face their wrath again. But for now, Ultramar stood strong, and Manager Calga, though scarred by the loss, remained unbroken. The galaxy trembled, as the stars themselves seemed to scream in agony. The Great Rift, a tear in the fabric of reality, had split the Empire in two, casting half of the Emperor's realm into darkness. It was as though the very heavens had opened, spilling forth a tide of chaos and corruption that swept across the stars like a plague. The Cicatix Maledictum, as it was called, was no mere stomach wound. It was a festering and bleeding wound, through which the forces of chaos poured, with unchecked fury. Among those dark forces came Nugal, the plague god, with his bloated legions marching forth with the stench of decay and rot. They came not as conquerors, but as disease, spreading their corruption with every step they took, tainting the worlds they touched. At their head was Motayan, the demon Pimpash of the Death Guard, a being of unspeakable power and malice. The people of Ultramar, who had known peace and prosperity for so long, found themselves besieged by an enemy that could not be fought with swords or bolts. The very air they breathed, the water they drank, had turned against them. But for all the horror that the plague god brought, Maemius Calga was ready. Calga had faced many enemies in his time. He had fought the Tyranids, the Orcs, and the Tau empires, but nothing could have prepared him for the plague god's hidden legions of Nurgle. The Death Guard were no ordinary soldiers. They were the walking dead, their bloated bodies swollen with disease, their armor rusted and foul. They did not die easily, for Nugal's gifts kept them alive, no matter how grievous their wounds. But worse than the Death Guards themselves were the demons that accompanied them. Horrific, twisted creatures born of darkness, their bodies oozing with filth, their laughter a mocking wet gurgle. The plague had spread to many of Ultamar's worlds, but it was the verdant planet of Ajax, known as the Garden of Ultramar, that became the focal point of Nugal's assault. Ajax, once a paradise of green fields and rich harvests, had been transformed into a charnel house, the once beautiful landscapes now choked with decay, the rivers and streams running black with corruption. The people of Eax had fallen ill, their bodies bloated and twisted by the plague, and among them marched the Death Guard, their mere presence spreading more sickness with every step. Calga stood at the head of the Ultramarines, leading the defense of the Axe. But it was no ordinary battle. The very land itself had turned against them. The ground squelched beneath their boots, as though the planet was rotting from the inside out. Even the air was thick with disease, and every breath taken was a risk. The Ultramarines, their bodies forged, resistant to many poisons and toxins, fought bravely, but even they were not immune to the foulness of Nugal's touch. Still, Calga pressed on. He knew that to give ground, he would be to lose. Not just Ajax, but all of Ultramar. His warriors fought with the discipline and precision, for which they were known, cutting down the shambling corpses of the Death Guard with bolt and blade. But for every enemy slain, it seemed two more would rise to take its place, and the plague continued to spread. In the midst of the battle, Calga received word that Macragge itself was under threat. The Death Guard had launched a simultaneous assault on Ultramar's capital, seeking to bring the heat of the realm under Nuggle's dominion. It was a tactic worthy of Motayan, one designed to stretch the Ultramarines thin, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. Calga, the strategist, knew that he could not allow the capital to fall. He issued orders to his lieutenants, delegating command of the defense of Ajax to Captain Sikias, while he prepared to return to Macragge. As Calga prepared to leave Ajax, a shadow fell over the battlefield. The air grew cold, and a sense of death filled the hearts of the warriors, who stood beside him from the darkened sky. A figure descended mountain, demon pimp of the death god, his wings spread wide, like a plague-ridden angel of death. His arrival was like a sickness, the very ground blackening beneath his feet, the air thickening with rot. In his hand he carried silence, his scythe a weapon that had reaped the lives of countless warriors. Motion's voice, when it came, was a whisper carried on the wind, but it was a whisper that echoed in the minds of all who heard it. Calga the demon Primaris said, his tone filled with mockery. You think to exist the inevitable. You think to stand against the will of a god. Calga did not flinch. He had known this moment would come. I stand against you, corruption. Motayan, he replied, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment pressed down on him. I stand for Ultramar. The two leaders met on the battlefield, their forces parting around them, like waves crashing against a rock. Montaigne's body was bloated and foul, towering over Calga, his presence a living embodiment of decay. However, Calga, clad in his indomitable gauntlets of Ultramar, was unshaken. He had fought demons before, and though Motayan was a being of immense power, Calga had no intention of backing down. The battle between them was fierce, their blows shaking the very ground beneath them. Motayan's scythe, Silence, moved with terrible speed, each swing cutting through the air with a sickening hiss. Calga countered with his gauntlets, their power cackling, as they met Motayan's blows with unyielding force. It was a duel of titans, each strike carrying the weight of their respective gods, one fighting for the Emperor, the other for the Plague God. But for all of Calga's strength and skill, Motayan was a demon pincushion, and the battle was far from equal. The stench of decay filled the air, and Calga could feel the corruption of Nugul pressing against him, seeping into the very earth beneath his feet. His blows, though powerful, seemed to have little effect on the bloated form of Motayan, whose laughter echoed across the battlefield. Yet Calga fought on not for glory, but for the people of Ultramar. Every moment he delayed Motayan was another moment for his forces to regroup, another chance to hold the line against the tide of corruption. In the end, it was not the strength of arms that turned the tide of the plague, but the will and leadership of Calga. Though he could not defeat Motion in single combat, he did what he had always done. He held the line. Calga's forces, bolstered by reinforcements from Macragge and the surrounding systems, slowly began to push back the Death Guard, their discipline and resolve proving stronger than even Nugul's plague. With each passing day, Calga's strategic genius became more apparent. He divided the enemy's forces, targeting the plague nodes that Motayan had established across Ultramar, cutting off the flow of corruption at its source. His counterattacks were precise and deadly, breaking through the Death Guard's lines and forcing them to retreat. Even the demons of Nugul, for all their unnatural resilience, could not withstand the coordinated assault of the Ultramarines. At last, after weeks of bitter fighting, the tide began to turn. The Death Guard, unable to maintain their hold on Ultramar, were forced to retreat. Their forces crumbling as Calga's warriors advanced, Mortian's plans thwarted, withdrew into the warp, vowing vengeance upon his brother's realm. Ultramar had been saved, but the cost had been high. The worlds of Ajax and many others lay in ruin, their fields and cities reduced to decaying husks. The taint of Nugul's plague would take years, perhaps even centuries, to fully cleanse. However, Calga, though scarred by the war, stood victorious. His defense of Ultramar had proven, once again, that the light of the Empire would not be extinguished. Although the Great Rift still loomed over the Imperium, casting its shadow across the stars, the people of Ultramar knew that, As long as Calga's courage stood, they would endure. The status had grown dark in recent years. It was not just the physical shadow, cast by the Cicatix maledictum, that spread across the fabric of the galaxy, but a shadow of despair that seemed to creep into every corner of the Empire. The 13th Black Crusade, led by Abaddon the Despoiler, had swept across the stars, with the fury of a storm long awaited, leaving worlds in ruin and hope in tatters. And at the heart of it all lay Cadia, a world upon whose steadfastness the Imperium had long relied. It was Cadia that held the gate to the Eye of Teo, that cursed rift where the forces of chaos feasted like a wound. In reality, for 10 millennia, the warriors of Cadia had stood watch over the Eye, holding back the tides of madness that threatened to spill out into the wide galaxy. And now, after all those years of defiance, Cadia had fallen. The news of Cadia's destruction reached Manius Calga aboard his battle barge, floating from the war-torn system, where the last of the Cadian soldiers had made their stand. He stood in silence for a long time. After hearing the message, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Around him, the officers of the Ultramarines spoke in hushed tones, their voices thick with the weight of the loss. Cadia had been a symbol of the Imperium's strength, an unyielding bastion of defiance. If even Cadia could fall, what hope was there for the rest of the galaxy? But Menelaus Calga, though weighed down by the loss, knew better than to give in to despair. The Imperium had faced darkness before, many times in fact, and each time it had endured, the Ultramarines in particular, had stood firm against the threats that sought to tear the Imperium apart. And they would do so again. Cadia's fall was a blow, yes, but it was not the end. He turned from the viewing screen, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the murmurs of his officers. The Emperor's light still burned. He said, his gaze sweeping over the room, "We will not falter. Cadia has fallen, but we will hold. Ultima will hold." His words were met with silent nods of agreement. Though the doubt in the room remained palpable, they all knew what Cadia's fall meant. The Eye of Teo, no longer bound by the defenses of the Cadian Gate, had expanded, spilling out into the galaxy with terrifying speed. The warp storms that followed in its wake tore through the fabric of space and chaos. Fleets, led by Abaddon himself, struck at world after world. But Calga's focus was on Ultramar. His realm, his home, the Ultramarines, had long prided themselves on their ability to endure, to remain a beacon of order and strength, even as the rest of the galaxy descended into chaos. But now, with the Eye of Teo expanding, that very stability was at risk. Calga knew that if Ultramar fell, the Imperium would lose more than just another sector. It would lose one of its greatest bastions of hope. Calga wasted no time. He summoned his captains, veterans of 1,000 wars, and set about organizing the defenses of Ultramar. Every world, every fortress, every defense platform in the system was placed on high alert. The cities of Macragge, the edgy worlds, the Foge worlds, each one became a part of a vast defensive network that would stand against the coming storm. It was not just a matter of holding the line, it was about coordination. The forces of chaos, with all their brutality, were often unpredictable, their attacks coming from unexpected angles, driven by madness rather than strategy. But Calga knew how to counter that. He had studied the Codex Astartes, had lived by its teachings for years. The Codex, written by Rabaut Guilliman himself, was a tome of wisdom, and within its pages were the tactics that would see them through this darkest of times. "Trust in the Codex," Calga would say as he stood before his office, "but adapt where needed." Guilliman wrote it as a guide, not a chain. We will fight as he taught us, and we will prevail. The defenses of Ultramar were bolstered, fleets were mobilized, and armies were deployed. Calga moved swiftly, issuing orders with the precision of a commander who understood the gravity of the threat they faced. The Eye of Teo now widened, threatened to swallow whole systems, and the forces of chaos were relentless in their attacks. It was not long before the Death Guard, the foul servants of Nurgle, appeared once more on the outskirts of Ultramar, spreading their plague as they advanced. Calga's mind, tuned to the many worlds that lay within his care, knew that Ultramar was not just a collection of planets. It was a symbol of hope, and order in a galaxy of chaos. To protect its people, was his sacred duty. Every battle fought, every inch of ground defended, was for more than just survival. It was for the preservation of the Imperium's heart. But even as Calga set about fortifying his realm, something extraordinary happened. Word came to him first as a rumor, then as a confirmation. From the furthest reaches of Ultramar, the Primarch Rabaut Guilliman, gene seed of the Ultramarines, and architect of the Codex Astartes, had returned. Calga had heard the legends. Of course, all Ultramarines had. Guilliman, one of the greatest warriors the galaxy had ever known, had been placed in stasis millennia ago, after being mortally wounded by Fulgrim, the demon Pimpash of the Emperor's children. He had been preserved, but not dead, awaiting a time when he might rise again. Few had ever truly believed it would happen, and yet he was the truth, spoken by those who had witnessed it firsthand. Guilliman had been restored to life, though the intervention of the Eldari and the technology of Archmagos Belisarius Call, the Primarch now walking among the living once more, had come to reclaim his place in the Imperium. Calga, for all his strength, for all his leadership, was struck by the enormity of the moment. His great father, the very foundation of the Ultramarines' legacy, was not a myth, not a figure of the past, but a living, breathing leader once again. It was as though the very stars had realigned, their light piercing through the darkness that had consumed the galaxy. There were no words, no speeches that could capture the full significance of Guilliman's return. Calga could only act, could only ready himself to stand before the man whose teachings had guided him his entire life. In the great halls of Macragge, where the banners of past victories hung proudly from the stone walls, and the air smelled faintly of cold, iron, and old parchment, Manius Calga found himself standing once again in the company of Rabaut Guilliman. It was no small thing, of course, to stand before a Primarch, let alone one who had emerged from the darkness of history, from the very edge of myth. Guilliman, the great leader of the Ultramarines, who had shaped the very destiny of the chapter, was no longer a figure spoken of only in stories or cited in the Codex. He was here, alive, breathing, thinking, and his gaze was as sharp as ever, filled with the burden of a galaxy on the brink of ruin. Yet, for all the grandeur of the moment, Calga felt no hesitation. There had always been a place for him, by his companion's side. Whether Guilliman had walked among the living or not, now with the gathering storm aging, and the Empire seemingly splitting apart at the seams, that place had only become more certain. The Cicatix maledictum that Tibur was in the sky had brought with it chaos and fear, but Calga had learned long ago that moments of great despair called for great resolve. And if there was one thing the Ultramarines had in abundance, it was resolve. Together, Guilliman and Calga surveyed the galaxy's troubles, like two captains studying an old and weathered map. Though they had many battles to fight, many plans to make, it was not with panic or frustration that they set about their task. There was a quiet, determined strength in their partnership. Calga could see it in Guilliman's eyes, a flicker of the same fire that had built an empire 10,000 years ago, and Calga himself, though forged in a smaller fire, had learned to harness that same flame. The organization of the Imperium's defenses was no small feat. It was as though they were standing on the deck of a vast storm-battered ship, trying to fight its course, while the winds howled and the waves crashed against them. But Guilliman, the old master of strategy, had a keen sense of the currents, and Calga trusted him completely. Ultramar must remain the heat of Ode in this storm. Guilliman had said, his voice measured and calm, "We must protect our people, yes, but also stand as an example for others. The Imperium needs hope. It needs to see that we can still stand firm." Calga nodded his thoughts, moving to the many worlds under Ultramar's care. Each one was like a jewel in a crown, glittering in the cold light of the stars. But now those jewels were dimmed, some darkened altogether, by the corrupting hand of chaos. The task ahead of them was daunting, to say the least, but Calga had never been one to shy away from hard labor. With Guilliman's return, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was order to be restored, and if anyone could see it done, it would be Robert Guilliman, and by his side, Calga. The first task was clear. Ultramar itself needed to be fortified. Though they had driven off Nugal's plague-hidden forces, in the plague was the scar of that conflict remained. The great cities of Macragge still stood proud. But other worlds had not fared so well. Fields once green and lush were now barren, and lives that had once been clear had been tainted by the foul corruption of the Death Guard. But Calga had the steady hand. They knew that fortifying Ultramar was not simply a matter of rebuilding walls and restoring defenses, no. They needed to restore the hearts of their people. It's not just the walls that have been damaged, Calga mused as he and Guilliman walked the ambits of Macragge's fortress monastery one evening, the wind carrying with it the distant sounds of construction. It's the spirit of Ultramar. We must remind them of who they are, give them hope, and they'll rebuild the best themselves. Guilliman smiled, though it was a brief, solemn smile. I've always believed that people can be stronger than they know, but they need leaders to remind them of that. They need to see that we are not broken. So it was not just a matter of stone and steel. Across the many worlds of Ultramar, the Ultamians worked to rebuild the trust and the hope of their people. When cities had fallen, they were rebuilt. When the fields had been scorched, new crops were sown. It was not just soldiers who took up this work. It was the artisans, the farmers, and the governors. Everyone played their part in the renewal of Ultramar. And always Calga was overseeing the efforts, his calm presence reminding the people that they had not been abandoned, that their chapter master was with them. But rebuilding Ultramar was only the beginning. Rabaut to Guilliman had prepared, not just for the defense of his home, but for the defense of the entire Imperium. Calga knew that the indomitable crusade, Guilliman's grand campaign to reclaim the lost worlds, would be one of the most challenging undertakings in the history of the galaxy. It was one thing to stand firm against a storm, but it was another entirely to set sail into it, knowing full well that the path would be fraught with danger. Guilliman, the strategist, had already begun mapping out the Crusade's many fronts. The three systems that had fallen to chaos, worlds that had been swallowed by the tides of the Cicatix Maledictum, and entire sectors that had fallen into disarray in the wake of Cadia's destruction. To reclaim these worlds would take more than brute force. It would take careful planning, coordination, and an unyielding will. And so the two of them, Pimac and Chapped Mast, set about the task with the same steady resolve that had seen Ultramar through countless trials. Calga, of course, was not just a bystander in this great effort. He became the right hand of Guilliman, his trusted lieutenant in every sense of the word. While Guilliman commanded the course, Calga was the one who carried it out. He oversaw the deployment of the Pimes Mains, the new breed of warriors created by Belisarius Cal, ensuring that these formidable soldiers were placed where they could do the most good. He worked tirelessly to organize the vast fleets of the Imperial Navy, ensuring that every ship was ready for the battles to come. And when the time came for battle itself, Calga was there at the forefront, leading his brothers with the same unshakable courage that had seen him through the darkest hours of the plague. Though the challenges were great, Calga never wavered in these weak moments. Of course, when the sheer weight of their task seemed too much for even the Ultramarines to bear, the forces of chaos were relentless, and the galaxy itself seemed to be tearing apart at the seams. But whenever doubt crept in, Calga would look to Guilliman, and there in his partner's gaze, he would see that same fire, that same determination to stand firm, no matter the odds. The partnership between Guilliman and Calga was one based not just on duty, but of mutual respect. Guilliman, though a principal, never dismissed Calga's experience or insight. In fact, he relied on it. There were many moments when Guilliman turned to Calga for counsel, trusting in the wisdom that had been earned over years of battle and sacrifice. And for his part, Calga felt an unshakable loyalty to his leader, not just as a leader, but as the embodiment of all that Ultramar stood for. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, a beacon of hope in a galaxy consumed by darkness. As the Indomitous Crusade marched on, reclaiming lost worlds and restoring order to a fractured Imperium, Calga and Guilliman stood side by side, their partnership a symbol of resilience and strength. And though the storm of war raged around them, they remained unbroken, guiding the Imperium through the gathering storm, with the same steady resolve that had seen them through countless battles before. The stars, though bright and countless, seemed farther away than ever, as the indomitable crusade began its long and arduous journey across the galaxy. It was a time of darkness, of shattered worlds and broken hopes, and yet in the heart of the Empire, a flame had been kindled. That flame was none other than Roboute Guilliman, the revered Primarch, whose return had sparked both awe and fear in equal measure. He had come not just to fight, but to heal the wounds of the Imperium, to bind together what had been torn asunder, and so the Indomitus Crusade was born, a grand campaign to restore order where chaos reigned. At his side as ever was Roboute Guilliman, who had stood steadfast, though the many trials that had beset Ultramar. Calgar had long been the guardian of Ultramar, but now his duties extended far beyond his own realm. The Indomitable Crusade was not just a matter of swords and battle, it was a journey of hope, of renewal, and perhaps of redemption. And in that great work, Calgar's steady hand would be as important as his strength in battle. The crusade itself was like a great voyage, one that stretched across the void, taking them from one end of the Imperium to the other. It was no small thing to lead such a campaign, for the Imperium was vast, so vast that entire sectors had fallen into ruin, cut off from each other by warp storms and Xenos incursions. And yet, under Guilliman's command, the crusade pressed on, always moving forward, always seeking to bring light where there was only darkness. The three worlds lost to the warp, their people long since forgotten by the wide Imperium, the three planets ravaged by the forces of chaos, their cities crumbling, and their skies choked with ash and smoke. But wherever they went, Guilliman and Caliban brought with them the promise of renewal. It was not enough to simply retake these worlds. Guilliman knew that they had to rebuild them, restore the Imperium's foundations, and so alongside every victory on the battlefield, there was the quiet work of restoration, of rebuilding the cities, of establishing the rule of law, and of reminding the people that they were not alone. The crusade was long, and the journey was perilous, but Guilliman never wavered. He had his eyes set on the far horizon, always thinking ahead, always planning for the next battle, the next world to be saved. And beside him, Calgar remained a constant presence, steady, reliable, and unshakable in his loyalty. Though the Indomitable Crusade was Guilliam's vision, it was Calgar who brought many of those plans to fruition. For as much as the Primac was a master of strategy, it was Calgar's tactical mind that often turned the tide of battle. His skill lay not just in his ability to fight, but in his understanding of how to lead men in the heat of war. One such moment came during the battle for the Cathis sector. The sector had long been under the thumb of chaos, its worlds twisted and corrupted by the dark forces that had ruled there. For years, the people had lost hope, their cities crumbling, and their skies filled with the taint of the warp. When the crusade arrived, it seemed that the forces of chaos were too deeply entrenched, too strong to be dislodged. But Calgar saw a way. He did not charge blindly into the enemy's strongholds, nor did he rely on brute force to overwhelm them. Instead, he devised a plan to divide the enemy forces, luring them out into the open, where they could be defeated in detail. He knew that chaos thrived on confusion, on disorder, and so he gave them just that. With a feigned retreat, Calgar's forces drew the enemy away from their fortifications, scattering them across the battlefield. And then, with precision and timing that only the Ultramarines could muster, he struck, cutting through the chaotic forces with swift and decisive action. The Battle of Cathis was a victory, not just because the forces of chaos were defeated, but because the people of the sector were freed from their tyranny. Calgar did not simply march onward once the fighting was done. He stayed to oversee the rebuilding, to ensure that the worlds they had liberated were, once again, safe. It was this attention to detail, this understanding, that the fight did not end when the guns fell silent, that made Calgar such a vital part of the crusade. Even as the crusade marched on, Calgar's thoughts often turned to Ultramar. Though it remained safe for the moment, the bodies of Ultramar were ever under threat, from forces of Xenos' aides, and from the creeping influence of chaos. Calga knew that his first duty was always to the people of Ultramar, and so even as he fought across the galaxy, he kept a watchful eye on his home. One of the greatest challenges came from the OKs, who had begun to mass near Ultramar's borders. They were a constant menace, always seeking to plunder and destroy, and Calga knew that if left unchecked, they would bring ruin to the worlds under his protection. So, even in the midst of the indomitable crusade, Calga took action. He led a series of swift and brutal strikes against the opposing bands, catching them off guard and shattering their fleets before they could gather their full strength. These battles were fought, for the Oaks were not easily defeated, but Calga's tactical brilliance, coupled with the strength of the Ultramarines, ensured that they were driven back, the borders of Ultramar were secured, and once again, its people could sleep soundly, knowing that their chapter master watched over them. But it wasn't just the others that threatened Ultramar. The forces of chaos, even more insidious, sought to capture the neighboring systems, spreading their influence like a plague. Calga led his warriors into battle time and again, fighting not just for victory, but for the very soul of the Imperium. Each victory he won was hard-earned, but each one brought him closer to his goal, to secure the future of Ultramar, and by extension, the future of the Imperium itself. The indomitable crusade was long, and it was filled with hardship, but for every battle won, for every world reclaimed, there was hope. And though it all, Medius Calga stood firm. He was not just a warrior, nor merely a leader. He was a beacon of strength, a steady hand in the storm. Wherever the crusade went, Calga's presence was felt on the battlefield, in the command centers, and in the hearts of the people he fought to protect. And so the crusade marched on, ever forward though the stars. The journey was far from over, but Calga knew that they were on the right path. With Guilliman at his side, and the strength of the Ultramarines behind him, there was no storm they could not weather, no darkness they could not banish. For the Imperium, though battered and broken, still stood, and as long as men like Manius Calga remained, it always would. The galaxy was changing, amidst the countless battles, and the freeing ambitions of the Indomitus Crusade. A new chapter was unfolding. In the long history of the Astartes, one that would shake the foundation of every chapter, from the farthest reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus to the heart of Holy Terra. This was the arrival of the Primaris Mains, a new breed of Space Marine, taller, stronger, and more formidable than even the greatest warriors of old. And with this change came new questions, new doubts, and new challenges. For Munius Calga, whose life had already been marked by transformations and burdens, the introduction of the Primaris Mains was both a moment of great possibility and one of deep contemplation. It was Archmagus Belisarius Cawl who first presented these towering warriors to the Imperium. The Primarch Marines were not simply soldiers. They were a product of millennia of genetic research, a vision of what the humans could be, untainted by the limitations of the past. They stood taller than their brothers, their armor a shining testament to the advancements of the Mechanica, and their bodies imbued with great strength, resilience, and skill. The first time Calga saw these new warriors, it was as though he was looking at reflections of the ancient legends, those great heroes who had fought alongside the Primax during the days of the Great Crusade. And yet there was something else in the eyes of these new warriors, something different. They carried the same unwavering loyalty, the same burning resolve, but they were like strangers stepping out of a long-forgotten dream. News of the Primax spread quickly, and with it came a stir of both excitement and unease. Those among the Ultramarines, and indeed among many of the other chapters, who looked upon these new ways with a mixture of admiration and caution. What did the arrival mean for the firstborn of the states? Those who had served the Empire for so long, would these new soldiers replace them, or were they merely a sign of change, of a new era in the Empire's defense? For some, it was an unsettling thought. The idea of being replaced was never a welcome one, and there were whispers of doubt and skepticism, even within the ranks of the Ultramarines. Some believed that this change was necessary, a gift from the Emperor himself, in this time of great need. Others feared that it was a step too far, a departure from the traditions that had kept the Empire strong for so many millennia. And yet, the Primaries were here, and the galaxy was in dire need of them. As the months passed, and the Primaris Mains took their place among the ranks of the Ultramarines, the question arose of whether the existing states should undergo the transformation themselves. The process was not without risk. Many had already heard the stories of those who had not survived the procedure, their bodies unable to withstand the strain of the gene modification. But the promise of strength, of renewal, was hard to ignore. Myas Kalga was not one to shy away from difficult decisions. He had always led by example, whether on the battlefield or within the halls of the fortress monastery, and so when the time came, he made his choice. Kalga would undergo the primary procedure, not out of a desire for great power, but out of a sense of duty. If he was to lead these new warriors, to stand as a symbol of resilience in a time of great change, then he would do so as one of them. The procedure was a long and grueling ordeal, and though Kalga was no stranger to pain, there were moments when even he wondered if he would survive. His body was already a vessel of strength, tempered by years of battle, but now it was being shaped, forged into something new. There were 3 nights when the pain was so great that it felt as though his very bones were being broken and remade. And yet, though it all, he held on, driven by the same sense of purpose that had seen him through countless battles before. When the transformation was finally complete, and Kalga stood once more before his brethren, he was not the same man he had been. He was taller, stronger, and his very presence seemed to radiate a newfound power. But beneath it all, he was still Myas Kalga, chapter master of the Ultramarines. The scars of his past remained, both those etched into his flesh and those carried in his heart. And in his eyes, there was the same unwavering resolve that had always defined him. His transformation was a moment of great significance, not just for Kalga himself, but for the Ultramarines as a whole. It was a symbol of the chapter's willingness to adapt, to embrace change without losing sight of who they were. And for those who had doubted the Primaris Mains, it was a sign that even the most steadfast leaders could find strength in something new. In the days that followed, the Primaris Mains continued to prove their worth, their strength and resilience shining through in every battle. However, it was Kalga's transformation that truly set a precedent. His decision to undergo the procedure showed not just the Ultramarines, but every chapter across the Imperium, that this change was not a threat to their traditions, but a chance to build upon them. Kalga's leadership in this new era was marked by both courage and humility. He did not flaunt his new strength, nor did he claim superiority over those who had not undergone the procedure. Instead, he fought as he always had, with resolve, with honor, and with a deep sense of duty to his brothers and to the people of Ultramar. His transformation had given him new powers, but it had not changed the man beneath the armor. And so, as the indomitable crusade continued, the Ultramarines fought with a renewed sense of purpose. The Primaris Mains, with their enhanced abilities, brought new strength to the chapter's ranks. Battles that had once seemed insurmountable were now within their grasp, and enemies that had once threatened the bodies of Ultramar were driven back. The impact of the Primaris Mains on the chapter's combat effectiveness was clear, and yet, the essence of the Ultramarines remained unchanged. Under Kalga's leadership, the Ultramarines continued to be a symbol of hope and resilience in a galaxy beset by darkness. And Kalga himself, now both a Fistborn and a Primaris, stood as a bridge between the old and the new. His transformation was a testament to the chapter's ability to grow and endure. In the quiet moments when the battles had ended and the work of rebuilding began anew, Kalga would sometimes reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought of the challenges he had faced, the battles he had fought, and the many lives that had been lost along the way. The road had been long, and it was far from over. But as he stood at the head of his chapter, surrounded by his brothers, both Fistborn and Primaris, he knew that they were ready for whatever lay ahead. During this time of great change, Myas Kalga had found strength, not just in the new power of the Primaris Mains, but in the enduring spirit of the Ultramarines. And as the stars continued to burn and the storm continued to rage, that spirit would see them through, no matter the trials that awaited them.